Hi guys, Brian from Boas here. The FedEx truck just dropped off a package for you with a live harmless reptiles sticker on the side, and you're super excited to open it up and meet your new boa. However, before you do this, please bear in mind that proper acclimation and quarantine procedures are very important for your new snake, both to allow it to acclimate to its new home as well as to protect your existing collection. So today I'm going to go over the general procedures that I use for acclimating and quarantining new additions to my snake collection. I'll also take out a few of my favorite boas for you to enjoy. If you like this video, please subscribe to the Brian Boas channel for more videos on keeping and breeding boas in captivity. So once you have the package delivered by FedEx, you want to take it into the room that's going to serve as your quarantine room that's going to be away from your main snake room. You want to have it as physically far as possible from your main snake room as can be provided based on your living situation. Some people actually have a separate facility, a separate address that they'll use as a quarantine, but this is probably not going to be practical for most people. So just having a room that's on the other side of your house generally is adequate for a quarantine room. But again, you want it as far away as possible from your other snakes and your other reptile pets if you have any. So once you open the package, you're going to want to carefully unwrap the snake, take it out of the bag or whatever internal packaging. And then you're going to want to do a cursory examination of the snake. Just make sure that it's as described, that it matches the pictures that were provided by the seller, and that there's no overt health issues. If there are any issues, get in touch with the breeder or the seller as soon as you can, preferably immediately, and let them know exactly what's going on so that hopefully you can resolve it with the seller and reach a solution that you agree on. If this is your first reptile, then no quarantine is going to be necessary because you don't have any other reptiles that could potentially catch a parasite or other disease from your new addition. However, most of us already have reptiles, so we need to be really careful that they don't get accidentally infected with a disease or infested with parasites from the new boa. So you want your quarantine room to have a completely separate set of supplies. All of the feeding supplies, hooks, feeding tongs, things like that are going to be completely separate. You want them away from the main snake room, and you don't want to mix things back and forth. In addition, you probably want to wear gloves when you're handling the new snake, and you definitely want to wash your hands thoroughly when going from your quarantine room to your main snake room. Most people will also change their clothes, and it's definitely a good idea to err on the safe side. Probably the number one issue that the quarantine will help you address are mites, and mites are extremely common these days. I actually did a video about mite and mite treatment previously, so you might want to check that out for more information about mites. But you can expect that you will get infested with mites eventually because there's so many of them out there, and people are selling and buying snakes so frequently that often they buy and sell a snake and they don't even notice it's infested with mites. So if you don't know what a mite is, they're these little blood-sucking parasites. They're like little, almost miniature ticks, and they go between your snake's scales and they suck its blood. They're pretty hard to see if you don't know what you're looking for, but typically you'll see a snake soaking in its water dish to try to get relief from the mites, and then you'll see these little black specks that look almost like poppy seeds from a bagel, and those are the dead mites. The soaking helps to kill some of them, but the mites are just very prolific and they keep coming back, and they're very hard to get rid of once they're established in your colony. So you definitely want to limit them to just the one snake, because if your whole colony gets infested, it can be an absolute nightmare to deal with. In addition, there are a number of diseases that the snake could potentially have which could infect your other snakes, and you definitely want to address them before moving your snake into your new snake into the main snake room. For example, the snake could have a respiratory infection. You might see some bubbling of the nose and wheezing when it's breathing. It could have inclusion body disease or IBD, and I'll say more about IBD probably in an upcoming episode. But the point is, if you see any kind of issue, you want to take your snake to the qualified reptile vet and treat that issue before putting the snake in the main snake room. And as a general rule, I recommend a minimum of 3 months quarantine. And this is if everything looks okay, if the snake has no issues over that 3-month period, then it's generally safe to move it to your main snake room. 1 month is not enough, believe me. The mites can go undetected. You can have, a mite that you don't even know is there, and then 2 months later it could become an outbreak. So you really need at least 3 months to avoid the possibility of mite infestation. If you want to do a longer quarantine, 6 months or even 12 months, that is fine. You can't quarantine for too long, but as a minimum, I would recommend 3 months. This is my general setup for quarantining animals. So I use these Sterilite 16-quart tubs, and this is for baby boas. A larger boa would obviously need a larger enclosure, but I keep them as simple as possible. So you can see I just have a basic paper towel substrate. So if there are any mites, they're going to show up because the mites are dark in color. I have one plastic hide, and then I have a water dish that's actually on this. It's connected to the side of the tub using a zip tie. You can see I have one that holds the water dish, and this one I actually put the water in, and then it sits in there. So I can just take it out, I can clean it or throw it away and use a new one. And you can see this whole tub and the water dish are see-through, so if there are any mites, they're not going to be able to hide. I've melted holes in the side for ventilation with a soldering iron, and I have a rack that holds this size tub that I use for quarantine. The other thing that I do is I will prophylactically treat for mites. Even if the snake doesn't have mites, if a new snake is coming in, I always treat the paper towel for mites. And I use this, this is a anti-louse bedding spray. You can also use another product called Preventamite, but they both contain an insecticide called permethrin. And I'll just spray the paper towel for a few seconds with this stuff. It's important that you let the mite spray dry completely before putting the snake in. As long as it's dried completely, it's not harmful to the snake, but it can cause health issues, can hurt your snake if there's still fumes that the snake inhales. During the 3-month quarantine period, it's important to keep handling to an absolute minimum, but you want to observe your snakes on a regular basis, at least several times a week, to see if they are displaying any health symptoms. So some things to look out for are central nervous system symptoms, like what's known as stargazing, where the snake tilts its head back at a sharp angle like this, or it could do corkscrewing, which is where the snake's body makes a corkscrewing motion. And these are maybe symptoms of a disease called inclusion body disease, although they can also be caused by a number of other central nervous system toxins or diseases. So if you see anything like this, make sure you consult a qualified reptile veterinarian for advice. You might also see regurgitation, which it can be related to IBD or to some kind of infection. Or you might see symptoms of respiratory infection, like difficulty breathing and wheezing when the animal's breathing, as well as bubbling from the nose or mucus discharge. If you see any signs like this, it's very important to go to a qualified veterinarian as soon as possible. As far as feeding your new snake, you should generally wait at least 1 week before feeding a new snake to give it a little bit of time to acclimate to its new surroundings. And then once it's feeding, you can generally feed at the normal recommended feeding regimen. For me, I feed an appropriately sized rodent every 2 weeks for animals up to 2 years of age. A couple more points to consider when you're setting up your quarantine room is you may want to provide a physical barrier to prevent mites, if there are any mites, from spreading from the quarantine room to your main snake room. And I've heard about people that go to pretty extreme lengths, and they'll actually suspend their quarantine cages above a huge moat of water. so that there's no way that the mites can cross the water to get out of the quarantine room and into your main snake room. And so I've actually used double-sided tape like this. So this stuff just has sticky on both sides, and you just stick it down to the floor. And if there are any mites walking around, they can get stuck to this. And this will also provide a physical barrier to prevent mites from moving around from the quarantine room to the main snake room. Another product is called diatomaceous earth, and this can be used as a physical barrier to prevent mites from migrating around. And I discussed this in my video that I did on dealing with mite outbreaks. So another thing to consider is that the timing of the quarantine room will be reset if you bring more snakes in. So if you have a boa that's been in quarantine for 2 months already, but then you bring in another fresh shipment of more boas into that quarantine room, you have to go back to 0. So that original boa that already has 2 months quarantined has to be quarantined an additional 3 months or longer, as long as you bring new snakes in. So it's generally better to just quarantine snakes at once. So don't get any new snakes until your original 3-month quarantine is up for the first new snake that you got. So hopefully after the 3 months is up, any issue that you saw in your boa has been resolved, and at that point it should generally be okay to move the boa to your main snake room. If there is still an ongoing issue that hasn't been resolved, it's important to continue the quarantine period until the health issue has been resolved in order to protect your main collection from any possible infection. So I thought I'd get out a few snakes for the last part of this video. This is probably one of my favorite holdback animals of all time, actually. This is a firebelly, a Honduran firebelly boa that was born in 2018. And I just love the pattern and color on this guy. You can see he's got a lot of patternless. His back half of his body towards his tail and his neck, you can see, are basically patternless. And then he has some really nicely well-defined saddles in the middle. And then you can see his fire belly coloration, which is starting to come out quite a bit as he gets a little older. But this beautiful pinkish orangish side and belly color that the Honduran fire belly boas are known for. And you can see he's got a characteristic head shape of a Honduran boa, which is a very short, stout head and very prominent eyes. And in these Honduran fire bellies, they're this beautiful orangish coloration. So just beautiful looking boa. So one more animal. This is a 2017 Venezuelan true red-tail boa, boa constrictor. And the Venezuelan true red-tails are one of my favorite true red-tails, and I think they're really underrated. They're relatively uncommon and hard to come by. So they tend to be a little smaller in size than the Suriname or Peruvian true red-tails, and the adults, some of them get to be 5 to 7 feet in length. And they have this beautiful creamy yellowish color and really nicely well-defined saddle markings. So this guy was bred by my good buddy Mike Lucchese. He's going on 3 years now, and I've enjoyed watching him grow. He might be ready to breed in about another 2 years or so, so possibly in 2021 or 2022 I might be able to offer some of these. And these are from a bloodline from Ron Greenberg and Gus Renfro that's said to have originated in the province of Apure in Venezuela. So I hope this video was helpful. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. If you have any comments or suggestions for your own quarantine, I would really appreciate it if you would write them in the comments section below. Thanks for watching, and enjoy your boas.